Kia ora, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for today's webinar about Horizon Europe. I'm Louise Vicenti from Organics Aotearoa, and I'm joined by Dr. John Creech, who's a Principal Advisor for MB. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. For today's Lunch and Learn, we'll be online for about 1 hour, and I'm recording the session. So please keep yourself on mute and pop any questions into the chat. In today's session, John will be presenting the funding opportunities available through Horizon Europe, which is the EU's key funding programme for research and innovation. So thank you, John, for joining us. Would you like to start?
Yeah, certainly. Shall I share my screen now?
Fantastic. Yes, please.
Yeah. Here we go. Let me know if that's not coming through.
That looks great.
But hopefully it is. Cool. All right. Yeah, Modi ora kia tātou. I'm John Creech. As Lou said, I'm a Principal Advisor in the International Science Partnerships team at MB. And my main role at the moment is in leading the domestic implementation of Horizon Europe, which hopefully you've already heard something about. But if not, this is going to be a great opportunity to bring you up to speed with where we're at with that. I've been at MB for coming up on 2 years now, but I actually come from a research background myself. I did my PhD in New Zealand and then spent quite a bit of my research career over in Europe. So it's been a real pleasure for me to sort of bring those parts of my life together and talk, do a lot of engaging with people from the research community and talk about how these new developments can be of benefit to them. So I think it's a really exciting new area, a new source of funding for New Zealand researchers. There's a lot of great opportunities, which I will try and talk through in the next little while. I think we should always start at the beginning for anyone who's not really familiar with Horizon Europe. What really it is, it's the 9th and the largest so far iteration of the European Framework Programme for Research and Innovation. The framework program started back in the 1980s, but as you can see on this diagram, the sort of duration and also scale of funding for each of those framework programs has continued to increase. From the 8th framework program, they decided to start having a sort of a more catchy name, Horizon 2020, and then Horizon Europe is the 9th framework program. The scale of funding there is really a massive compared to the sort of numbers we're used to in New Zealand. The total funding for the 2021 to 2027 period is on the order of 160 billion New Zealand dollars, billion with a B, so it's absolutely massive. New Zealand is only associating to part of the Horizon Europe program, Pillar 2, which I'll describe what that is in a minute. But that is the largest part of Horizon Europe, which is focused on science and technologies that address globally significant challenges and things like UN Sustainable Development Goals. I will speak more about what it includes in a few minutes. But just the Pillar 2 part alone has a budget of on the order of 90 billion New Zealand dollars. So it's still pretty massive. So this association has all happened pretty recently, and I'll talk about that process. But New Zealand's the first country outside of the sort of European neighbourhood to achieve this status. And a number of our traditional bilateral partners are in the queue in discussions to try and join as well. So in the future, we'll see associations from countries like Canada, probably Japan and South Korea, and Australia is also having some discussions around it too. And so there's lots of opportunities to collaborate outside of just the European neighbourhood as well, which is part of the whole purpose of this project is to sort of increase global collaboration and focus on these globally significant challenges. I just thought I'd mention a little bit about how we got to this point. New Zealand has a long track record of cooperation on research and innovation with the EU. That was really formalised in 2008 when we initiated an agreement on science and technological cooperation, which entered into force in 2009. And the whole purpose of that was to reinforce and enhance cooperation on areas of mutual importance. That included specifically focus on areas like food, agriculture, fisheries, biotechnology, things like that. our Horizon Europe Association sort of came on the radar in around 2019. That's when the European Commission decided that they were going to open up their framework program to other liberal, like-minded democracies from around the world. And they really only began doing that in 2021. And so New Zealand is the first country from outside of that European neighbourhood to reach this point of associating to the program. So that all happened reasonably quickly. Our exploratory talks started in late 2021, and already by the end of 2022, we had a European delegation visit New Zealand. We had a series of negotiations towards our association agreement. And already just before Christmas, we initialed that agreement. So that all going from from square one to initialing that agreement took just over a year, which is very, very quick for this sort of international agreement. So where things are now, the agreement takes the form of a treaty, as all of these sort of international agreements do, and we expect that treaty to be signed. We're expecting that in July, which is very soon, and really exciting for us. But as of the initialing of that draft agreement, we had a provision with the European Commission that New Zealand researchers would be in a transitional period, meaning that expecting that our association would be formalised by this sort of time, that New Zealand researchers could already apply, expecting that they'll be able to be funded after we sign this agreement. So that's all on track to happen. So our researchers who already began applying in the March and April rounds of this year, those who are successful will be able to receive their funding from later on in this year, which is really exciting progress. Of course, we can't talk about our association without talking about part of this broader context in New Zealand. I'm sure everyone here is aware of Te Aotearoa, which is the sort of ongoing New Zealand science system reforms. The Minister launched her Te Aotearoa white paper in December of last year, and that presents this high-level vision for New Zealand's RSI system going forward. That includes sort of key policy directions and, of course, the roadmap to the implementation of those reforms. The new system is really geared up to focus the challenges and opportunities facing New Zealand, things like climate change, natural disasters, improving our well-being, lifting productivity, all of those sort of key goals. And those are all very much aligned with the part of Horizon Europe to which we're associating. Really happily, our agreement with the European Commission explicitly acknowledges our responsibilities under Te Tiriti, the need to protect Mātauranga Māori, and it's also, of course, intended to create opportunities and realise benefits for all New Zealanders, and so that sort of aligns with the Te Aotearoa goal of embedding Te Tiriti and Māori aspirations across the program. For us in the International Science Partnerships team, thinking about how we connect internationally, one of the objectives that's expressed in the white paper is that enhanced global research and innovation connectivity. And so for us in the International Science Partnerships team, our goals as part of Te Aotearoa are really to ensure that our individuals and institutions are well supported to have international partnerships. They go beyond Horizon Europe, and there are other ways that our team supports those, other funding opportunities, which we can also help connect you with. But Horizon Europe is definitely our main focus for that, particularly in the context of Europe, obviously. We also focus on making sure that our both emerging and established researchers have opportunities to work internationally. I think that's really important. Of course, we also want to make sure that New Zealand is seen as a top quality destination for international researchers, and these sort of international partnerships are a great way to make sure that happens. Where we start from in New Zealand is actually really good. New Zealanders are really well integrated into global RSI efforts, research, science and innovation efforts. Most of our researchers work with at least one international collaborator. Most work with many more, and many have European collaborators. In 2022, about 20% of New Zealand publications had a European co-author, which is sort of on the same sort of scale as how many of our publications also have Australian or US co-authors, and the ones with European co-authors compare very well in citation metrics, if that's important to you. So it's our connections with Europe are very good. We've got a lot of experience in the New Zealand research community in engaging with European researchers or in participating in these framework programs. New Zealanders have participated in those previous iterations of these framework programs as well. The difference was that before our association, they could only receive funding on very limited terms. Now, with our association, we're on equal terms to those in Europe. So that means we can lead and receive full funding under the Horizon Europe program. So that's a big change. So this slide shows the structure of Horizon Europe as a whole. You can see that it's divided mainly into these three pillars. The pillar one is sort of more akin to maybe our Marsden Fund, a little bit like some of the Endeavour Fund, or it includes a bunch of these fellowships, I guess maybe a bit like the Rutherford, for those of you who are familiar with these New Zealand programs. Pillar two is more, it's maybe like a souped up Endeavour Fund, or maybe more akin to our National Science Challenges. Pillar two is divided into these clusters, is the terminology. These are, like I said, science and technologies that tackle globally significant challenges, UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're built around key sort of research priorities and impact areas. They cover things like green transitions, future foods, climate adaptation, and many other topics. So for the rest of the talk, really, this is the part we'll be focusing on, because this is where our opportunities for New Zealand lie. All of these things have intersections between them as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for people in any part of New Zealand to cooperate with people across all of these clusters. And those areas I mentioned align really well with our current and future research priorities. So Horizon Europe's clusters and missions, which are part of the same pillar, but they're things with a really clear target of a goal that they're trying to achieve by 2030. These provide many opportunities for New Zealand researchers. So to speak a little bit more about the sort of vernacular of Horizon Europe, to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because I know I tend to just throw these terms in, and I need to make sure I define them so that everyone knows what I'm talking about. So within Pillar 2, the work program is broken down into these thematic clusters. And within those clusters, there are what they call destinations, and I'll show a bunch of those in a moment. But just to be clear that it's the difference between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is that Pillar 2, and it's probably a bit unlike what we're used to for most of our funds in New Zealand, is that these are top-down research funds. And what that means is that there are calls for funding for specific topics that are determined by program committees. They're sort of set up to align with these strategic goals, but they will the work programs that are published for each of these clusters includes information, all sorts of information. I'll cover it in a minute, but the topics are predetermined, and you're applying to solve one of these particular problems, as it were. In fact, most of them are quite broad, so that they're not. It wouldn't be at all limiting. If anything, I think it probably makes applying for these things easier, because you don't have to guess the sort of thing that the committees are looking for. They've laid out what they want, and you apply to address a particular topic. Hopefully, I don't think I expressed that all that well just now, but hopefully it will become clearer as I talk through some of the next steps.
Hey, John, can I just ask a question? We've got Tom in the chat asking, can research projects sit across several clusters?
So you're always applying to a specific topic that they've called for, but some of those topics are clearly spanning clusters, and some of them are occasionally joint between the different work programs, but most of the time you're applying to a particular topic. But that doesn't mean that the topic is narrow. So many of them you'll find it's hard to express this without a specific example in mind. But many of the individual topics are very broad and span subject matter areas. So this is hopefully some of this will become clear. Maybe I can address that further at the end if it hasn't become clear. So please ask again at the end if it's still unclear. So this slide lays out the 6 clusters and the destinations under those. So the destinations are kind of like sub-themes, and it's under all of those destinations that all the individual topics are laid out. I guess that some of the things I want to make clear about this is that hopefully that's, I know it's a lot of text on that slide, but hopefully it's drawing your eyes automatically by looking at just the cluster headings to a particular cluster. And then if you scroll down through some of those destinations, I think most researchers in New Zealand will find at least one or two headings that resonate with them. So, like I said, it's a bit different from the New Zealand system, but each of those destinations has quite a few projects listed underneath them. To give actual numbers, I should have mentioned already that the work programs that are determined by these program committees are published for just shorter periods. They're not trying to guess right from the beginning, because the Horizon Europe program goes 2021 to 2027. They're not going to try and guess right at 2021 what all of the topics they want to address are. So they publish these work programs covering 2-year periods at a time, although they do get periodically updated even within that time. But if you were to go to the work programs now and look under each of those cluster areas, the top row of numbers in the blue box at the bottom shows the number of topics that are published in each of those clusters. So you can see that they're actually quite a big number. The bottom row is the total funding applied to each of those clusters throughout the Horizon Europe period. But even then, even for the smallest ones, we're talking 1 or 2 billion euros to cover all of those topics. The cluster 2 and cluster 3 are the smaller topics, but they still contain a substantial amount of funding even for those. So yeah, hopefully there are a few things catching people's eyes here. I think that based on the group, the Organics Aotearoa, probably the cluster 6 is the one that's of most relevance, and I imagine we're probably looking at things like the circular economy and bioeconomy destination, and the resilient, healthy communities, all of these things there. So you can see that under those clusters, there are 176 topics. And that doesn't mean there's 176 projects that will be funded, because many of those topics under there will fund 2, 3, 4 projects. So there are many opportunities. And as I've said, the topic calls are usually quite broad, so that there's a lot of scope to cover probably any kind of topic that you're interested in. It'll be covered by one or another of those calls. And as I said, I think that these clusters and the missions that sit alongside them align really well with New Zealand's sort of strategic directions and areas of New Zealand's strength as well. So I think that there's plenty of opportunities out there for New Zealand researchers. So how would you go about finding a call? As I said, Pillar 2 is a top-down system, and so those open calls are published in these work programs. They publish a work program for each of the clusters, and as I said, the current ones are for the period 2023 to 2024. The topics that are published under each of those work programs, they close at different times of the year, but most of them clump around March, April, or September, October. And you can go through these work programs and find all of the current calls that you can already see the ones now that are published for 2024 as well. So not just the ones that are for September, October of this year, but March, April, and September, October of next year as well. So I'm happy to share these slides at the end as well. And each of when you see one of these web pages, that's hyperlinked, and you can click on it and it will take you directly to what you're seeing there as well. So I'll make sure to share these at the end. But if you were to click through to this page and open up one of the work programs, what you'll see is that those are a rather massive PDF file with hundreds of pages. The Europeans are fantastic at producing documentation, which is sometimes a problem because there is just huge masses of information, which is one of the roles that we provide, is helping filter that information to give you what's important to you. And I'll talk more about how we'll do that going forward. But there are other ways to interact with this information as well. So you can either download those work programs as a PDF from the web, or you can go to the European Commission's Funding and Tenders portal, which is in many ways probably the easier way. I think that for most people that will be the easier way. You can filter by cluster and destination, and you can see all of the sort of linked things. Like you can find people who are advertising that they're searching for partners in a particular topic, which is really useful as well. So if you search through and find any opportunity that you're interested in, this applies in both the PDF and on the web version. There's a whole bunch of information there about each of those calls. That includes the topic scope, the expected outcomes, the impacts overall of the destination that the topic belongs to. There's things about the type of action, which I will talk about briefly in a minute, and also, of course, really importantly, the budget, so that you sort of know how much funding is available to do the work, and you can design your consortium and project accordingly. So those are the things you'll definitely want to check out for each of them. I've over the next few slides, I've got a kind of example of how you might use this. So if I went to the Funding and Tenders portal right now and put in a search for organics, which is what I did here to kind of try and come up with the example. The slide shows a few examples of some topics that came up, but this is just 3 that fitted on the page. There were probably dozens, and that's just with that as a keyword. There are many topics that would be relevant to you that don't necessarily come up with that keyword, but you could browse within that cluster or destination for more. And so you could click through any one of these that you see. You can see that they even on that headline, they show the type of action and the sort of the deadline for applications in that call. And if you click through to it, it would also lay out things like the budget, the problem definition, desired outcomes, all of the things that you'd need to address in your proposals, and of course any specific conditions relating to that call. So if I click through, for example, into one of them, this is just the top of the page. You could scroll down and there's a huge amount of information about each of these, which it makes your job of maybe writing your proposal relatively easy. And if you scroll down, for example, I just try to pull out an example that would be useful. There's no need to read through all of this text, but just to make the point that they lay out pretty clearly what they're looking for. So you would design your consortium and your project to deliver these outcomes, and it makes putting together your application simpler than if you were just having to come up with everything and not sure what they were looking for. So as I mentioned, each of those the listed topics we'll talk about what type of action it is. So I just thought I'd quickly cover off what they mean by those types of actions. There are 2 main types of actions, which I think New Zealand organisations will be looking at, which are split on the basis of essentially how close the research is to the market. This technology readiness level scale might be something that you're already familiar with. If it's not, essentially it goes from at the bottom, we're talking about really fundamental research, and at the top we're talking about things that are just about ready to go to market, and in the middle, well, middle-ish, things up to technology readiness level 6 would be considered a research and innovation action, and things above TRL 6 would be an innovation action. The reason I just make this distinction is that there is some slight differences in how the funding works for innovation actions versus research and innovation actions. In both cases, the projects, most things are actually very similar. In both cases, the projects are typically sort of 3 years. That's the sort of norm, 36 months. Sometimes you can negotiate to have it go over a longer period, but the funding would just be spread over a longer period. They're typically sort of between a few million to maybe 15 million euros for an individual project. So I think that's, with the currency conversion, it's quite a lot in New Zealand dollars. That obviously is split between your consortium, and so that's another sort of key difference with these both of these types of actions. I'll talk a bit about consortia in a minute, but that your project applications must come from a consortia that has minimum criteria that, like, they have to include at least 3 countries, 3 partners from either EU member or associated countries, and at a minimum 1 EU member country. But so both of these types of actions both have that same requirement. The real difference is that for the innovation actions, if you're a for-profit company, you are funded at 70% of your budget. That does not apply if you're from a non-profit or a research institution, but if you're from a for-profit company, that applies. So I just make that clear. You'll also see sometimes there's another type of action that appears in the work program called coordination and support action. Those are smaller projects that are really just aimed on improving cooperation between countries. They vary a lot around things. They're either like standardization, training, sometimes promotion and communications. Those types of actions receive a smaller amount of funding, but can be led by a single entity. But given the sort of nature of them, they're trying to produce that cooperation between countries. That's probably one area that might make it more difficult to do from New Zealand. But also with the smaller amount of funding, I imagine that probably most New Zealand organisations will be mainly focused on these innovation actions and research and innovation actions anyway. So yeah, I already mentioned a little bit about consortia. This is one of the things that's kind of different from what maybe people are used to in New Zealand, given that you have to build a network of partners from these different countries. But it's also one of the real appealing things for us about associating to Horizon Europe. You know, there's already domestic funding available for some of these things, but the benefit that we get out of our association is that we tap into this huge wealth of knowledge and this bigger ecosystem in Europe. So having these international consortia is a plus about it. So as I said, New Zealand partners can participate on equal terms with the Europeans in this. So that means we can join or lead consortia. We can fully receive funding. It's possible for there to be multiple New Zealand partners in the same project. So that's one thing that's probably also different if you're familiar with Endeavour funding. It's normally that funding is given to one organisation, and if there are other partners involved, you would do that by subcontracting. That's sort of frowned upon in Horizon Europe, and instead the way to include other partners would be to also have them be partners in the project. I mentioned those minimum requirements for building a consortium, but as I said, those are minimum requirements. You have to have at least 3 member or associated countries, but most projects will have far more than that minimum number of partners. It's probably more common for them to have 5, 10 or even 15 or more partners. It entirely depends on what's required to undertake the project, and also the scale of funding that's applied to that. So you can kind of have a guess about what's expected based on the scale of the project. But so long as you can credibly deliver the work program, it's not like you have to keep adding partners. One other thing I'd like to mention is that third countries can also be included. As I said, New Zealand participated in the previous framework programs, but it was very difficult to receive funding. So most of the time, the partners just had to cover their own costs and just be part of the program without receiving funding. So you can include other countries. For example, we could include Australian researchers in a project, but yeah, it would be difficult for them to receive funding. But that's not always true. For low to middle income countries, the European Commission has a complete list that I could share with you, but a lot of low to middle income countries can automatically receive funding under Horizon Europe without needing to associate. So that includes a lot of our Pacific Island neighbours, and including them in your project means that they could receive funding, but it's also a great way to demonstrate the impact that your project will have, and the applicability, that it could be spread to more countries in the world. So for a lot of European organisations, including New Zealand partners, it's going to look really good for them for the project assessment. But for us, also including our Pacific neighbours, we'll do the same sort of thing. So just to say a little bit more about the consortia, not every person participating in a consortium has the same level of responsibility. Of course, there always has to be one partner who is the leader of the project, the coordinator, and their job is to sort of, they do definitely take on a bigger administrative burden. They have to, make sure that all of the partners are delivering what they need to. The coordinator is responsible for all of the reporting back to the European Commission, and so it can involve a lot of chasing after partners to get their for them to feed into the documents. But I do think that we will still see New Zealand partners wanting to take on that coordinator role in the fullness of time, because there's a lot of prestige and great networking opportunities that come from being a coordinator. That said, it's much easier not to be the coordinator, and so I think we'll, at least while New Zealand researchers are still getting used to this program, I think we're more likely to see more partnerships with New Zealand partners taking on these lesser roles. They still can be significant to take on the leadership of a whole work package as part of a project. Obviously, the sort of the amount of funding that each partner receives relates a lot to the amount of work they have to do in the project. It's possible to participate in a project right down at the lowest level, down like called it here a task partner. And if you're doing that, then the amount of work you have to put into doing a submission is actually pretty small. The coordinator it takes on the lead role of writing a proposal, and they just seek input from all of the partners relevant to the part of the work that they'll deliver. So you could, and without having to do a whole lot of work, be a partner down at that level. But of course, you won't necessarily receive the biggest part of the budget. There is a real art to designing a successful consortium, and you want to make sure that you have all of the skills necessary to deliver the work program that you've proposed. But you also want to make sure you've represented the right balance of skills. So it doesn't necessarily mean just finding people who are doing the exact same research as you from around the world. It's actually really beneficial to sort of include different areas of expertise that are complementary. So it's really worthwhile thinking about. In terms of finding European partners, I'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about our national contact points. This is NCPs that's mentioned here. They will play a role, but as I've mentioned, I think a lot of New Zealand researchers are already well connected to Europe, and so it may be these existing relationships that are really important for establishing these partnerships. If you have any existing partners in Europe, they will already be experienced with this funding system. They'll have a great idea about the topics to get involved in and how to get involved. So that's going to be a really valuable resource going forward. I think, I'll move on to this slide. The evaluation criteria for Horizon Europe proposals is very, very much along the lines of any other research fund you've applied for. They're assessed on the basis of three categories: excellence, impact, and implementation. You have to get at least a minimum score for each category. And so, like I said, it's really important to design your consortium to credibly deliver on all of those fronts. There are a few key parameters here that may be a little different to what you're used to. The European Commission now built in some key requirements around things like open science. That should be less of a problem now, given that we have some minimum requirements around this in New Zealand as well. We have an open research policy for all of our MB funds. The main difference with the European one is that when they require open access of your research publications, they need them to be immediately available on publication. Whereas the New Zealand policy still allows for some period of exclusivity for the publisher, but the Europeans do make funding available to support that, so it sort of doesn't really create a particular barrier. There's also, you'll see in this list some information about a gender dimension. What that's about is that if you're from any kind of public body, research organization, higher education establishment, you have to have a gender equity plan in place that is publicly accessible, so people have to be able to read it from the web essentially, and you have to have made arrangements for monitoring and training and capacity building and things like that. For most of our research organizations, this is we've made all of our universities and CRIs, for example, aware of these requirements, that most of them have all of that information, but just not all gathered into one place and maybe not publicly available. They don't need to be available necessarily now, but by the time you would sign a contract. So it's something worth keeping in mind if that applies to you. In most ways, like I say, the assessment is very similar to what you're kind of used to. Same with the sort of time frame. If you submitted a proposal today, you'd sort of be looking at around maybe 5 months to find out if your application has been successful. And then sort of even after that point, there's this grant agreement preparation period. There are two big documents that have to be signed as part of a Horizon Europe project. One is the funding agreement that you sign with the European Commission to receive the funding. And then there's a consortium agreement, which you sign with your partners in your consortium, that sort of lay out who will do what, but also who will own any intellectual property and things like that. Just to be clear about this, because it's something that I get asked about, particularly with respect to Mātauranga Māori and Indigenous data and things like that. One thing to be aware of with Horizon Europe is that unambiguously, the intellectual property remains the property of the partner that produces it. The European Commission do not assert any ownership over data. The only thing is that where it's required to share the data with your collaborators for the sake of undertaking the research, you would of course be expected to share it with them there. I mentioned that the projects, some of them are sort of focused on the innovation end, where you're likely to produce a commercial product. Your consortium agreement would lay out, when you might produce a commercial product, who would own what share of that intellectual property. It's an important document, the sort of thing you'd probably want to get checked over by a lawyer and things, but the European Commission provides a lot of great guidance about that, including templates and examples and things like that. So it's not a huge difficulty, even though I might have made it sound pretty intimidating. So how would you practically go about being involved in a bid? A little bit, this depends on your role in the project, but I've already mentioned the Funding and Tenders portal. That same Funding and Tenders portal is where all of your applications and things like that happen. And it's also a gateway to lots of other information. All the guidance and documentation there is super useful. If you wanted to submit a proposal, you need to register your organisation through the Funding and Tenders portal, and you would need to get one of these PICs, a Partner Identification Code. It's pretty quick and easy to do that, but before you could sign a contract, you have to go through a validation phase, which just means, so basically it's providing some evidence of the existence of your legal entity and for example, bank details and things like that. It's not a huge barrier, but it can take some time to organize that information. In every one of these partners also has to have a LEA, a legally entity appointed representative, and they are the person who sort of administers all of your organization's details in the Funding and Tenders portal. And so that let's say that you were going to be a partner in a project, the coordinator would fill out all of the project information, and then they would essentially invite you as a partner to the project. And only the LEA can do that unless they've made delegations within an organization. So like a lot of this stuff depends a bit on the scale of your organization. If you're a small organization or even an individual, that's obviously pretty straightforward. If you're from a big organization, it can be a bit more of a there are a few more layers, but it's all pretty straightforward. And if you get stuck, there's all sorts of support that we can provide. I think I have, this is an example of how you can, there's a button there to register your organization. And you can also search for those partners in the portal. If you're from, depending on what organization you might be from in New Zealand, you might actually find that your organization is already registered and potentially validated if they've been involved with the project before. So it's worth checking on there, especially if you're from an organization that might be in there, because there can only be one partner identification code for any legal entity. This is just, I gave an example here of having searched for a specific New Zealand organization. So in this example, I searched for Massey University, and you can see that they already have a validated partner identity code. There is also, through that portal, you can contact the LEA, that person, and make inquiries that way. It's probably not the normal way to go about reaching out about projects, but it is a way to, for example, if your organization is listed in there and you don't know who your representative is, that's a good way to find out. I think that's all I need to say about that. One other key thing that's really important for New Zealand researchers is our domestic top-up scheme. So the way that we fund our overhead costs in New Zealand is quite different from many other parts of the world. In Europe, those things are often sort of bulk funded, and so that when they provide overheads or the sort of indirect costs to a project, they fund them at a lower rate than what our research funding normally would in New Zealand. And so recognizing that, and to ensure that our researchers can, meaningfully and equitably participate in the Horizon Europe program, we're providing additional research funding, overheads funding for New Zealand research institutions. So when you get a project funded, the European Commission will fund you at 25% of your eligible direct costs as indirect costs. Our top-up funding will bring that up to 100%. We don't do any sort of additional assessment of the merits of the project. If your project is successful in Horizon Europe, you're eligible for that funding. And it's not specific to any particular type of organization, at least for the time being. So any organization, if you're from a small company or any kind of smaller entity that maybe operates at lower overheads than some of our big institutions, you will still receive that full complement of funding. So it's a really valuable additional source of funding for New Zealand organizations. Actually, on top of that, some of the things that we typically charge as overheads in New Zealand are eligible to be direct costs in the European funding system. So that means that you actually end up with even more funding, which is, I think, a really, really great thing. We could have easily ended up with a system where our research organizations were expected to wear the cost of their own participation. So I think that it's a really positive thing that we're able to provide this additional funding. One requirement is that if you're submitting a bid into Horizon Europe, that you notify MB of your bid. There's a simple form available from the webpage, which is linked in the slides here. And the MB webpage is a great place for you to visit to make sure you keep on top of all the other developments around our Horizon Europe Association. And I had a note that this is all new funding, so it's not taking away from any of our other domestic funding schemes. The budget, which was announced a few weeks ago, included money to cover the costs of our association, including these domestic top-up funds. So I think that's a really great thing for the New Zealand research sector. So coming to the end of this of me blabbing on breathlessly. And I just wanted to talk a bit about the various ways we'll continue to provide support to the sector. A really key one of those is the network of national contact points that I mentioned. So national contact points play a really important role in spreading awareness of the opportunities that are available through Horizon Europe, and also providing training on how the program operates. As I mentioned, that mountain of amazing documentation that is available can be a bit intimidating, and is one of the ways that we can help is to sort of filter out what you don't need to know and connect you directly with the bits of information that you do need. So that will be one of the things that the national contact points do. They will also, so they'll be able to point you directly at particular calls in the work program that might be of relevance to you. And they will also play a role in connecting New Zealand researchers with potential partners, both domestically and in Europe. One of our national contact points is also our Science and Innovation Councillor in Europe, which you might not be aware that we even have, but MB and also some of the other New Zealand government departments have these science councillors positioned in different parts of the world, with that being part of their role is to help sort of facilitate research partnerships between these regions. And so that's another resource that's available. In fact, some of these other countries have got Science and Innovation Councillors based in New Zealand, and if you've never met any of them, that's another great opportunity as well. Through these national contact points, and also through our colleagues at EurAccess, which is an initiative of the European Commission that provides all sorts of information and advice. So the EurAccess there is linked. They have a person based in Australasia who can really help make connections to different parts of different parts of the funding system in Europe, including things outside of the part we're associated to. There are lots of other opportunities for fellowships and things like that they can connect with. So in collaboration with EurAccess, we'll continue to put on various training sessions and potentially networking events. The European Commission also puts on networking events, some of which you can attend remotely, but if you're willing to do overnight meetings, which we unfortunately have to do quite a lot, but there will be other opportunities that we will do to help connect New Zealand researchers with European potential partners, including potentially taking some sort of delegation and making doing events in Europe to try and raise the profile of New Zealand research organisations. So there are lots of opportunities there and things that we'll continue to provide information about on our website and through those national contact points. I also had that one last point there about opportunities to be assessors. Through that funding and tenders portal, you can also sign up as an expert, and you might be called upon to review proposals for Horizon Europe, which is a really excellent way to become familiar with the program, what makes a good proposal, and you might get opportunity to travel to Europe to participate in a panel and things like that. So it's a really great networking opportunity. So yeah, that's just about done me out of breath. I've left a few key points on this slide here, but I think I've covered all of these things. We're really committed to making sure that there is resources available for New Zealand researchers to participate in these programs. The final page of this presentation includes my details. So and through that NB web page, we'll also make the details of those national contact points public once they're appointed, which is hopefully going to happen all in the next few weeks. So yeah, like I said, we're available to help. I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can actually see all your faces again. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, but we're really willing and happy to help in any ways that we can. So I hope that's been useful, and happy to take some questions if there's time.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. Erin's asking, John, can chambers of commerce also participate?
So in principle, yes, any legal entity can participate. So that includes local government, and it includes small enterprises and things like that. Yes, I think that there are definitely parts of Horizon Europe where that kind of, I mentioned that it's about designing a consortium with the right mix of capabilities, and a Chamber of Commerce might be an excellent example of how you can ensure that whatever outcomes you produce from this project are able to be implemented in the real world. And so absolutely, that could be a really great way to include that sort of expertise.
And Tim's asking, are they in France or the Republic of Ireland?
Are they?
I presume. Tim, feel free to unmute if you have any more questions, but are we talking about
it was the New Zealand government officials that science advisors, I think you were referring to.
Councillors, yes. So we have, as an MB, 3 around the world. So one that covers Asia, one that covers North America, and one that covers Europe. And so our European councillor is based in Brussels, but covers a huge area. And so yeah, both of those countries are included in his domain, as it were. So he is really well connected across Europe, and it's really good for making those kind of connections. But yeah, there are other government departments also. So one that might be particularly relevant to this group as well is MPI. They have also councillors that are spread more around Europe as well. They have one in Spain and maybe a couple of other European countries. And so, between all of these government networks, which are, they're a public asset, as it were, so they're part of their job is to help make these research connections. I think there's a lot of useful connections available through those.
Great. Does anybody have any more questions?
Certainly. Sorry, the minimum requirements you referred to before, if I was, for example, to be looking at an organization in New Zealand, Pacific Island, like Fiji or the Cook Islands, and one European Union country, would that be roughly a meeting those minimums?
Not quite. So that while I said, you can continue to build your consortium beyond those minimum requirements, you still have to meet those. And so that means that you would have to have, if you wanted to add one to that consortium, if you included, another associated or EU member country. So as long as you've got one EU member country and at least three partners, who are from either EU member or associated countries. Once you go beyond that, you can include whoever.
We have Erin asking, just to clarify, does Pillar 2 cover only pre-commercialization research?
So I would say that those research and innovation actions, they include what I would consider commercialization. Absolutely, many of them are intended to produce a commercial product that at the end of it will, be of use to whatever area. It's hard. I don't have a specific example in mind, but yes, they're fully right at that commercialization end of the spectrum. Which is partly why that, if you're from a for-profit company, that you won't receive the full, they won't cover all of your costs, because they want those for-profit companies to have some skin in the game and, not just subsidize all of the commercialization work. But, if you're delivering a commercial product that's in line with those priority areas, that's fully in line with the scope of the program.
Right, any more questions for John? And if not, I will share all of the information that John spoke about today in a follow-up email to everybody, and with the recording as well. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to John for coming online today for that presentation. I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. And please feel free to get in touch if there are any other questions.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, John.
Got it.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll follow up with an email now with those slides, and you can share them around.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Ka kite anō.